Dear students, dear faculty members and guests of the university, my name is Andrei Baikov. I'm Vice Rector in charge of International Partnerships, and you haven't come here to see me. It's my great pleasure and honor to be standing up here to introduce the person who doesn't really need an introduction for anyone studying international relations, but for those of you who decided to come here just out of curiosity, I'll still do this. So I'm here to introduce Martha Finnemore, who is a University Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington. Her research focuses on global governance, international organizations, ethics, and social theory. She's best known for her award-winning books like National Interest and International Society, which is on the curriculum of the Theory of International Relations at our undergraduate program, The Purpose of Intervention, Rules for the World. All these works have helped to pioneer constructivism as a new paradigm and a new tradition in the theory of international relations. In 2009, a survey of over 2,700 international relations faculty in 10 countries named her one of the 25 most influential scholars in this discipline, and one of the 5 scholars whose work in the last 5 years has been the most interesting. In 2011, she was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Finnemore completed her BA at Harvard, followed by an MA from the University of Sydney and a PhD in 1991 from Stanford, which she did under the supervision of Stephen Krasner. Her articles have appeared in International Organization, World Politics, Annual Review of Political Science, Review of International Studies, and other top-ranked international relations journal. She has been a visiting research fellow at the Brookings Institution and Stanford University. On a more personal note, I must add that my first encounter with Professor Finnemore took place 11 years ago, when I was a visiting scholar at the Elliott School of International Affairs. And then, my value scale was completely turned upside down when I discovered with what ease and eagerness Professor Finnemore was ready to meet with me several times to help along with my research, and how she subsequently continued to remain in correspondence with me, meticulously answering some of my naive and sometimes outright dumb questions over the years. I also admire her for the writing style. The way she chooses and is able to talk about pioneering unconventional truths is so accessible and pleasant to read that I took her books away to my beach holidays to read, so engaging and entertaining this was a read. Finally, I'm infinitely grateful to Professor Finnemore for accepting our invitation to visit for the first time Russia and to deliver a course of 3 lectures for our students. This is the first lecture in the series, with the other 2 to take place on Wednesday and Thursday. Thank you very much for your attention. Please join me in welcoming Professor Finnemore.
Thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. I think you are slating your own intellectual interests. I enjoyed very much our conversations when you appeared in my office and introduced yourself. And thanks to MGIMO for hosting this lovely event. I'm delighted to be here. So my talk today, as Professor Baikov said, is about constructivist theory in international relations. Constructivism is one of the most popular theoretical tools that we have in the field today. According to this same survey data that Professor Baikov mentioned, there are more IR scholars now who identify themselves as constructivists than realists, liberals, Marxists, critical theorists, or other kinds of paradigms. So I think it's worth getting to know this line of theory and worth acquainting yourself with what it might offer you as researchers, what kinds of questions it can help you answer. So constructivism emerged on the international relations scholarship scene in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, just as the Cold War was ending. None of the dominant international relations theories of the time, and certainly none of the international relations theories that I was trained in, predicted the end of the Cold War. Everybody was surprised in the academy. None of them could explain it even after the fact. They had no good theoretical explanations for the end of the Cold War, which was the biggest event in IR theory of my lifetime, I hope. I hope that nothing bad happens. So, and it wasn't just the end of the Cold War. These theories had trouble explaining all kinds of pressing 21st century problems. They cannot explain the rise of radical Islam and terrorism. They're not very good at civil wars. Civil wars are now much more frequent than interstate wars, but if your unit of analysis is the state, sub-state conflict is theoretically problematic for you. They're not very good at financial crises and economic collapse and panic like we saw in 2007 and 2008. So there's been broad interest in finding different theories, different theoretical tools that can help us explain the world that we're living in. Where could you look? The conventional theories like realism and liberalism had connected themselves to economics and rational choice as the theoretical underpinnings. That's the kind of theory they used to develop explanations and predictions. Those weren't going so well. It was a good time to look farther afield, and many of us turned to sociology and to social psychology, looking for ways to understand the politics we were seeing. So the roots of constructivism lie in those two fields, in sociology and social psychology. So what I want to do today is give a quick overview of constructivism, lay out some basic elements of constructivist analysis, and along the way, I'll try to connect this with and compare this with realist and rational choice theories, just to make clear what's different between the two lines of theory. Then I'll provide a couple of examples of how could you use this in your own research? What kind of question could you answer with constructivism that realism or another theory might have difficulty with? So, big picture. At its core, constructivism is about ideas, and particularly it's about shared ideas. Ideas that we share as people, as citizens, as states, and how those ideas shape politics in different kinds of ways. One early constructivist scholar, a fellow named John Ruggie, put it this way. He said, "Constructivism is about the role of human consciousness in international life. It's about our ideas about the world and how those ideas actually reshape the world we live in, how ideas can create new kinds of politics and can create change in politics." So constructivists would say studying people and politics is not like studying atoms in physics. We're not that kind of science. It's not like studying billiard balls on Kenneth Waltz's billiard table. What we do is a different kind of science. It is truly a social science because it studies social relations. People are self-aware. People, as objects of study, they reflect on, they think about what they do as they live their lives, make their choices, and move through the world. They learn from their actions over time, and people care about what other people think of them. They care about other people judging them. People are social in a way that atoms are not social and billiard balls are not social. And realist and rational choice theories do not capture those social relationships and that reflexivity, that self-reflection and awareness that's at the center of the human experience. But constructivism dives directly into those kinds of problems and is very much concerned with those social relations. It is not uniquely a theory of international politics. It is a broad social theory. And in this sense, it's like rational choice. Rational choice, you can apply to anything. You can apply it to firms, you could apply it to people. It just assumes that rational actors with fixed preferences are making instrumental choices. Constructivism is similar. It is a broad social theory. You can apply it to your family, you could apply it to the United Nations. It's a broad social theory that scholars in international relations are harnessing to explain international politics in particular. So as a social theory, as opposed to just an IR theory, constructivism is more like rational choice than it is like realism, and it provides a broad notion about how does the world work. And specifically, it focuses on two things. Social theories of all kinds, rational choice, constructivism, tell us first how agents or actors in the world, the actors might be states, the actors might be people, how those actors or agents are related to big social structures. How do they relate to, for example, the international system as a big structure? And the move that constructivists make that's very different from these economics-based theories is constructivists see agents, the actors, and big structures as mutually constituted. And that's complicated, so let me spin that out for a minute. States and the people in them, our agents, create social structures. So this is obvious in some ways. Where do states come from? People create them. We have in the United States founding fathers, George Washington and all those guys. And they founded this, you have czars, they found the state. People create states, but the process also works in reverse. That big social structures, once they're in place, exercise influence and shape the agents. They shape the people. They shape the states that are embedded in the social structures. So the institutions of society shapes who we are. It shapes what we want. It shapes what we do. So the core of constructivism is the claim that the political world we live in is one that, on the one hand, we ourselves have made, but also the world continues to shape us and remake us, changing what we want, changing how we behave, changing how we see ourselves as actors in it. So society and our environment shape what we want, who we think we are, what we value, but we have agency. We can change society. We can change politics. We can change social structures. The seminal article on this is Alex Wentz's piece on the agent-structure debate that again draws on this sociology literature. It came out in the late 1980s, an international organization, and lays this out in a very nice, clear way. And that article changed the thinking of a large number of scholars, especially young scholars. I was a first-year graduate student when this came out, so it had a big effect. And since that time, this group has been trying to unpack this mutual constitution process and understand how it plays out in international relations. So this enterprise of understanding how actors create structures and structures shape actors is very, very different from rational choice and realist-based theories in IR. Those theories make very different assumptions about agents and structures and how the world is put together. Rational choice theories and realism assume some static, fixed set of actors, for example, states. Those actors have static, fixed preferences. All states want security, all states want wealth, whatever you think states want. And those agents and structures, those states and their preferences, are in a fixed environment, a fixed social structure that they call anarchy. So these realist and rationalist scholars assume they know who the important actors are. It's assumption of the theory. They assume they know what the actors want. It's an assumption of the theory. And they assume that the actors themselves are aware of that and know what they want and agree, in fact, with the analysts. And they're assuming that all of these actors are using an instrumental means-ends kind of logic to make their decisions about how they behave in the world. So they're assuming a fixed set of actors acting instrumentally in pursuit of fixed and known preferences in a condition of anarchy. That's, in a realist world, what gives us the politics we see. And with all those assumptions, realists can generate all kinds of testable hypotheses and theories about how politics works. This can be useful It can be very useful, and some of my best friends are realists. I love them dearly. But this is also, I would argue, very limited. Constructivists have a much broader and, I would say, deeper view of politics. Constructivists want to ask questions about many of the things that rational choice-based theories just assume. For example, constructivists want to know where preferences and national interests come from. Other theories assume states know what they want. But do they? Do states know what they want? I mean, I live in Washington. Much of the debate in that city, much of the time, is about exactly this question. What would be good for the United States? What are US interests in this region or that conflict? So is China our friend? Do we want, or is China our enemy? Do we want more open trade with China? Do we want a trade war with China? An assumption that and the answer to that is the United States government doesn't know. I mean, this would be my view. We are fighting about this endlessly. And the Congress does not agree with the president. It's a mess. But the assumption that US preferences then are fixed and that the US knows what it wants in some clear, unproblematic way just seems implausible to me. I mean, when I live in Washington, it is implausible to me that this government always knows what it wants because it's fighting about it all the time. So what constructivists would do is turn the assumption about what states want into a research question, something we scholars can investigate. We would ask, how do states come to know what they want? How do they understand their interests? And how do those interests change over time? A lot of constructivist research takes this form. It asks questions about things that these other theories take for granted, treat as assumptions. So one other important feature of constructivism is that it's dynamic. Constructivism is about change. Mutual constitution, where agents shape structures and structures shape agents, that's a process. It's a dynamic process. It's a process of change. And constructivists are very, very interested in how change happens in world politics. I mean, realism and rational choice, I think, have a very different approach to this. Those models often emphasize equilibrium for many of the game theoretic models that were popularized by realists, for example, and some of the economic liberals emphasize equilibrium. That might be a fine thing if you think the world is a static, stable place. If you think the world is in equilibrium, a theory that assumes equilibrium might be a fine theory to have. Constructivists tend to think that most of the world, most of the time, is not in equilibrium. Most of the world, most of the time, is changing. So constructivist theory is better suited to deal with change, and therefore more interesting and attractive for us than these equilibrium static theories, because we don't think the world looks that way. So how do constructivists go about doing their research? This is a very big question. I have very small time, so let me introduce three big concepts that constructivists find useful. Concept number one would be social facts. This comes out of Durkheim, for those of you who are interested in social theory. And the definition of a social fact is a shared idea that shapes our perceptions of what's real and shapes and constrains us as we move through society. The classic example of a social fact is money. Money is a social fact in this sense. Those paper rubles that you have in your wallet have no value in themselves, right? The bits of paper, you can't do anything with those. You can't eat them. You can't, you could build a very small fire with them. You can't do anything useful with them. The pieces of paper only are useful if other people think they have value. It's the fact that we share a belief, share the idea that these little pieces of paper are valuable. That means I can go in and hand the shopkeeper a piece of paper and get a sandwich. Or I can hand someone some pieces of paper and get a ticket to Moscow. Know that I can convert the little piece of paper into something useful only happens because we all share this idea about money. And you can see this too in politics. When people stop believing in the value of money, what happens? When people stop believing that the paper has value, you get economic collapse. You get hyperinflation. You get the Great Depression in the Weimar Republic and all the rest of it. So money is a classic example of this. Another example that's very prominent for international relations scholars is rights. Rights only exist in the social world if we all believe they exist, if they become embedded in institutions, embedded in law, embedded in culture. Rights aren't a physical thing. They are a shared belief, and they're politically powerful. They fuel revolutions of many kinds. They constrain state governments in the way they treat their citizens. But they have no material reality. They exist because people share a belief that, yes, there is a right to this thing. So moving more quickly, concept number 2 and concept number 3 are about agents and about structures. Concept number 2, identities and preferences. How do I know as an actor what I want? How I know that depends on who I think I am, my identity. Am I a democracy? Is that my identity? If I'm a democracy, then I want elections, I want freedom of the press, and all the stuff that goes with democracy. Am I protector of the free world? Do I think that's my identity? Well, then I need to help ensure my preferences would be, my interests would be to make sure that those free elections and freedom of the press exist in other people's countries, which may or may not be a good idea, but that was what the identity would want. So where your preferences come from and how identities change over time, those attributes of actors and agents, this interests constructivists very much. This is a big part of constructivist research, and there's lots written about this. The third big concept I would put out there has to do with the structure side of this agent-structure relationship. And I'll call this a bucket of things. These are the social structures that shape agents, and the 3 big ones that have interested constructivists are institutions, norms, and rules. So the insight here is that these social structures, these institutions, norms, and rules are powerful. They shape what people want. They can shape what states want over time. And much of my own work has been about looking specifically, my own interest is in these international organizations like the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations. These are big international organizations. Over time, big structures can shape what their member states want and what individual people want. One example that a good colleague has written a book about is the way the European community, later the European Union, has been successful at this. When Europe was created as a project in the 50s after the war, there were no Europeans. And the way policymakers posed their challenge was this: how do we create Europe without Europeans? Everyone thinks they're French or German or Italian. They don't think they're European. But they've been working at this now for 70 years, and they are slowly over time developing an identity. People in Western Europe, especially young people, actually think of themselves as European. That's meaningful to them in politically consequential ways. And there's interesting research on how that came to be. So, what would you do with this? How could constructivism be useful? What can constructivism do for you? The kinds of questions I can answer with these constructivist frameworks, I would argue, are quite different from the kind of questions that realists would address. And let me give you two examples of the kinds of questions that constructivists can tackle and would be interested in, and try to explain as I present them why this is puzzling for realists, why they don't have great explanations of these kinds of events. So the first case study I would offer you is about the origins of the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. So there's a puzzle here. All good research starts with a puzzle, a question, something I don't know and I need to understand. And the question here flows out of the following logic. In war, above all other situations, we should be able to treat states as actors and soldiers as self-interested, rational, utility maximizers, simply because in war, the most basic interest, survival, not getting killed, is at stake. People don't mess around when they think they're in danger of getting killed. They're going to be logical and ruthlessly rational. But in fact, when you look at the institution of war, it's a very social institution that has elaborate social rules going back hundreds or thousands of years. Think about chivalry in the medieval knights and codes of the warrior in all kinds of different societies that might be very far from here. War is a social institution that has always been highly regulated with deep rules and notions of honor and notions of glory. And in contemporary life, we have embodied those rules in something called the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions specify a whole variety of protections for wounded soldiers on the battlefield, for medical personnel who come to care for those soldiers, and for civilians, non-combatants who are also involved in the war. It requires states to protect not just their own wounded soldiers, but enemy wounded soldiers. This is one of the most widely signed and accepted agreements in the interstate system. Every state is a member of the Geneva Conventions, but it puts a limit on the core sovereign prerogative. What is the most basic prerogative, the most basic right of a state? It's its ability to make war, the monopoly on violence. And this says to states, you cannot do just anything you want. You cannot use your violence any way you want. There are rules. You can only hurt and shoot some people. You cannot hurt and shoot wounded soldiers, civilians, and military people. Why would states sign such a thing? Where did this come from? Where did this social structure, this set of, it's now international law, norms and rules, come from? There are agents creating this social structure. There are agents creating this Geneva Convention. And in this case, it's an agent that realists would say should be totally unimportant. It's a small, non-governmental organization based in Geneva that we now call the International Committee of the Red Cross. A realist would expect a whole handful of Swiss guys, they're all Swiss, I think they're still all Swiss, to have no power. They have no guns, they have nothing. But they have created and promoted the ideas of humanitarian protection for civilians and wounded soldiers. And they have persuaded states that these were good ideas to adopt. So how does this happen? How did the agents persuade all these states? I mean, there's a long story about this, so I'm going to condense the story because I don't have so much time. But there is one guy. His name is Henri Dunant, or he's Henry Dunant if you speak English, but if you're French, he's Henri Dunant. He's a Swiss banker from Geneva, and he was in the town of Castiglione in 1859 when the big battle of Solferino happens, and all the wounded are coming into his town. Soldiers are dying in the streets, and they're left to die there. Why are they left to die there? Why doesn't someone take them into their house? The civilians don't want to take in the wounded soldiers. If I take in an Austrian soldier and the French army comes, I get shot. I'm a collaborator. If I do it the other way around, if I take in a French soldier and the Austrian army comes, I get shot. So I leave them in the street. and just let them die. So Dunant saw this happening and had an idea. Ideas are important. He wrote a book, and the book was a very smart book. It has a first section that is this very lively and fun account of his what he saw on the battlefield that everybody wanted to read because it was so entertaining. But the second part was a policy proposal that said two things should happen. All states should do two things. All states should set up national aid societies that would follow the army around and provide medical attention and supplies to treat the wounded. And all states should sign a treaty that would recognize these relief societies and treat them as neutrals, not target them, not hurt them, and make them outside of combat. So he has this book becomes the toast of the salons of Europe, and he targets his proposal, his persuasion initiatives to military doctors. When he convenes the conference, he doesn't want to talk to army generals because he thinks he'll get dismissed. He instead approaches the doctors in the military because the doctors have a duty, their identity is to save life. That's what they want to do. The doctors want to protect the war wounded. So the doctors are his entry point for this persuasion effort to get states to change their mind, to get them to respect these protections for these new relief societies, which every state has. There is the American Red Cross. I assume there's a Russian Red Cross. There's a Turkish Red Crescent. Every country now has these. So every country is a signatory to this, and by the time you get to the 21st century, this is a very elaborated set of institutions, a very elaborated set of laws. So what makes this a particularly constructivist line of research? Three things. It's about ideas. It's about changing people's minds, changing their interests, their ideas about what they want. And in this case, it's changing states' ideas about what they want. Rational choice doesn't tell you very much about that. Neither does realism. Preferences, number two, preferences are not fixed, as they would be in other theories. Prior to the Red Cross and the efforts of Henri Dunant and his friends, states had no idea they cared about the wounded or protecting civilians. The idea came from these civilian actors, this NGO, that persuaded states this was a good thing to do. And three, this is about the creation of new social facts, new things that now in the 21st century, we just treat as reality, part of the landscape, fact of life. And the facts it creates are rights, rights for the war wounded, rights for civilians to be protected. It doesn't mean that no rights get respected all the time. That's true in domestic politics, it's true in international politics. There are always violations, but now there is a widespread understanding of what good behavior looks like. And conversely, this is what makes clear what a violation looks like when it happens. And where does that come from? It comes from this small, powerless NGO and its ideas. Another very quick example would be economic development. This is a huge international activity. Billions of dollars, thousands of people from every country are involved in development work around the world. Realists take for granted, I think, that economic development is a goal of states. It's an assumption of the theory. States want wealth, so of course states want development. Constructivists are more curious about this, and they would ask different kinds of research questions about things other theories just assume. For example, constructivists would say, what is development exactly? Develop into what? What are the goals of development? How do you know when you get there? How do you know when you're developed? And they would also ask, where did development as a task for states come from? When did states start doing development? And particularly, when did they start doing it for other countries in other countries? George Washington and the czars did not have ministers of development and were not out there doing development in other countries. Where does this big international activity come from? Well, historically, the place that has had to wrestle with questions of development is, again, an international organization. It's not a state. Our understanding of what development is and how that changes is at the World Bank. And it's the staff of the bank that make a lot of the decisions about how we, as an international collection of people and states, what we think we're doing when we do this development. The understandings that the bank has have changed over time. In the early years of the bank, the goal of development was understood to be rising national GNP. It was the goal of the bank, the goal of development was to make states richer. Where the money goes inside the states, not the bank's problem. And in fact, the bank is probably barred from interfering with what happens inside states because that would be a sovereign prerogative. Governments get to determine how to distribute wealth. And the way they raised money to do this was lending. The bank will lend for big hydroelectric dams and roads and other things. Those projects produce money. You can sell the electricity from the hydroelectric dam, and then you repay the loan to the bank. The bank was a bank in a very bank-like way. And the early heads of the bank were all trained as bankers. That's what they knew how to do. They were put in charge of the World Bank because they had been bankers in their previous life. This changes in the 1960s. There's a new head of the World Bank, a fellow named Robert McNamara. He was not a banker. He did not share those ideas of the bank. He was a manager. He ran Ford Motor Company before he came to the World Bank. And after he ran Ford Motor Company, he was Secretary of Defense for the Vietnam War, which was not going very well, so they pulled him out of the Secretary of Defense and put him in the World Bank. So he was a very different kind of thinker, and he had a very different idea about development. He said, no, it's not about making states richer, it's about making individual people richer. The World Bank's goal should be to reduce global poverty. This is not the goal that the founders of the bank put out. The founders of the bank did not think this was what development was about. But McNamara decides this is how it's going to be going forward, and he is able to bring into the bank a whole cadre of economists who developed the intellectual architecture for understanding how we could do this and why it's a good economic idea. The major shareholders of the bank were not pushing for this. They were not interested in this. But again, economists in national governments bought into these ideas. They made economic sense to the economists. So as conversations from one economist to another took place, the bank was able to persuade national governments that they should be doing this poverty alleviation project rather than the banking they had been doing before. And this sticks. This is what the bank does now. If you go to the World Bank website, what does it say? A world free from poverty. That is their goal. And this spreads as well. It's not just the bank now. If you go to the United Nations website, 17 sustainable development goals for all the members of the United Nations. And what's goal number 1? Zero poverty by 2030. So there's still this idea that we should alleviate poverty in other countries, continues to be this widespread national interest of states. So like the Geneva Conventions case, this is very much a constructivist project that looks very different from the way a realist would choose a topic or carry out research. This is about changing ideas and how changed ideas change policy. So it asks, how did we come to understand that reducing poverty around the world and reducing the poverty of other states' citizens, how did that come to be in the national interest of the United States, of Russia, of the G7, of the European Union, the big rich countries? Why should they care about poor people in poor countries? But they do, and they send big money to these places. You can trace the history of this back to the origins of new development thinking at the World Bank. Conventional international relations theory, I think, and rational choice certainly would have trouble explaining how that transformation, that change in thinking, in ideas, goals, and preferences, how that happened. They don't have a good theory for this. But constructivism is trying to understand exactly those questions. It's questions like how interests change, how goals change, how the world becomes a different kind of place, and how individual actors can make that happen, how Henri Dunant or Robert McNamara, how their ideas can get connected to big organizations and change state policy in sweeping ways. So for constructivists, politics isn't just about actors pursuing interests. Much of politics is about actors trying to transform and change interests of other states in ways that realist theory, rational choice theory, doesn't give us a lot of room to think about. But for constructivists, this is what we do. This is the kind of research that excites us. These are the kinds of questions that interest us. So thank you all very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone might want to ask. Please.
First of all, thank you so much for such a nice lecture. It was very nice to listen to. I'd like to ask you the following thing. You said it yourself that there's been a tremendous change in the concepts and the ideas after the Cold War. And there's been many changes in terms of understanding at least theory of international relations. And there is constructivism. There are a lot of other theories. They all sound very nice. They all sound very logical. But what concerns me particularly is that nowadays, administration of the United States and many other countries in the world, they now seem to be very much into realism or neorealism again. Why are we into this kind of situation again? Why are we again into realism? And why are we again all those countries that think about their national interests first, and then get lucky they think about people?
No, that's an excellent question and a very timely one. Thank you for that. I think if I were a constructivist, I would, and I were thinking about your question as a research question, because that's how I think, is I want to turn this into a research project. It's a great question. So one of the things I would want to know two things. Well, I would want to know a million things, but let's start with two. One of the things that my colleagues, for example, and you're right that this turn toward a more nativist, populist politics is not happening. It's happening in multiple places. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in the United States for sure. It's happening in Brazil. It's happening. There's sort of a swing to the right that makes this look this way. One thing constructivists do frequently is, and we are in deep conversation also with our area studies colleagues, because we want to understand how do these states figure out what they want? What's going on? What is it that the United States wants? I mean, elections in a mechanical way put a new president in power, so we have new things happening. But presidents have limited power. We're still members of the World Bank. We still give lots of foreign aid. We still are supporting the Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions and doing all these things. So there's a stickiness over the long haul that individual leaders have trouble undoing, but there's a time horizons problem here. I've been interested in long-term kinds of changes because I find those interesting. But for your change, there's been a lot of interest in how, for example, big macro structures of the economy fuel those kinds of populist movements. But I think these are also hard for realists and rational choice. A lot of these nativist policies are economically irrational. Right? The trade war with China is silly. I mean, every economist in the country thinks this is a foolish thing to be doing. It's going to make us poorer. So the realists are also not doing so good at explaining your problem. And this search for tools is an important project for understanding those kinds of things, because a lot of this nationalism is about ideas. It's actually not. If I think about Trump supporters, we have a conversation in the United States about this. They seem impervious to facts. They don't care. It's almost like religion for them. And that does not look realist. It does not look like rational choice. So a constructivist would have to ask, what ideas are fueling that political impulse? And would try to frame a project around that. Yes, please.
So I had this question since I started studying international relations. And when we start studying the subject, we study different theories, and they make us analyze different events based on justification from the theories. And every theory has a different justification. And the more you study, the more you realize that the theories can be interconnected. So
yes.
Nothing can be explained just by one theory, and no theory is right or wrong. So do you agree that everything could be explained by combination, or would you be able to explain something just exclusively by a constructivist approach?
I'm skeptical of ever understanding everything. I live in a state of perpetual ignorance, and I'm very conscious of the number of things that I do not know. But I think your question here about how do I, as a researcher, sort of frame a project and figure out what's the right theoretical tool to help me understand this question here. So what's the right theoretical question for your tool? You're getting a toolkit in your education. And there might be certain kinds of research problems you look at and you say, this particular research problem looks very realist to me. I mean, I think I can get a pretty good realist explanation out of this. Everybody does seem to know what they want on the time horizons I care about. I could do this with an analysis with realism. And that's fine if that's the right tool for you. One of the things in my own research, especially given that I'm interested, I tend to choose questions that are about change because it interests me. And when I want to explain change, those are not so useful. So I would think of this more as a toolkit that as a researcher I'm trying to figure out what kind of question do I want to ask? What kind of theories are best suited to help me explain what I'm seeing? And you might be right that there are these things can get interconnected. There are constructivists who would tell you a story about realism, which says realism is, at bottom, a whole bunch of ideas that came from a certain place, got taught to a whole lot of students, who then went and populated lots of foreign ministries, and guess what? They all act like realists. There is nothing surprising about this, because you were all socialized to think like realists. And during the Cold War, this was very active in the United States. But there are these, Emanuel Adler has this very interesting piece where he describes how it is that the Soviet and American conversation about deterrence in the early days of nuclear weapons, they had to teach each other rational choice because this was not the natural impulse. Certainly on the American side, Dwight Eisenhower thought these were just big bombs. And we're just going to treat them like big bombs in our war planning. You don't get to mutual assured destruction until this much. It takes them 15 years to develop this set of shared ideas that underpin deterrence. Game theory has to be explained to people. It's not like they were born as babies with game theory coming out of the milk that they drink. I mean, this is not what's happening. So I could tell a constructivist story about different pieces of realism. That just might not interest you, or it might not be useful for what you want to do. But it depends on the question. The theory should match the question you want to answer.
Do you agree that a specific theory can be used for a specific event?
I'm not sure I understand. You mean that there's a one-to-one correspondence? Every event has a theory that's suited to it? No.
All the theories can explain an event, but throughout different theories, would you still go for a constructivist approach? So look at like individuals underneath the whole process, even in an event like that.
Yeah, I mean, the Crimea case is interesting because, there's an old Japanese movie called Rashomon where you see the same event a whole bunch of times on the screen, and you're learning more and more about the event with each telling, because each one is from a different point of view. So I could imagine telling the Crimea case, and maybe as a researcher this is a useful exercise, to construct in your head, all right, how would a realist explain this? How would a constructivist explain this? How would any other theory, a Marxist or critical theory, and line them up? Which ones are some more persuasive on some points? Or where are they fighting? And could you do research to settle the fight and figure out who's actually correct? That can be another good way to structure a research project in your head, is to say, who would disagree with my argument about Crimea? And take them very seriously and say, how would I convince them? What evidence would it take? Where could I find that evidence that would persuade them that their explanation of Crimea is wrong, incomplete, inadequate in some way? And sometimes when I hear people argue, a lot of the argument hinges on what satisfies you. What do you think is a satisfactory explanation? And I think what John Mearsheimer would find satisfactory and what I would find satisfactory might not be the same thing. So, more questions? Oh, yes, please.
Thank you for your lecture once again. It was wonderful, and I'd like to ask a question about are there like key social facts or key milestones in constructivism that, for example, I don't know, they're changing, but they're changing very slowly or something like that?
This goes back to this question about choosing the right theory for the right question. I mean, if you're looking at a very short time period and you don't think if you think if you're looking at a very short time period, you might decide that for the purposes of your analysis now for this question, there's not a lot of changing of minds going on here. In which case, you might not need to get into all of this social theory mess. You can operate at a much higher level of abstraction and simply make a lot of assumptions. I mean, a lot of this has to do with, do I think the assumptions of realism, for example, is that a reasonable assumption for the question I want to ask? Maybe if we have some very short period and nobody's changing their mind, no one's arguing, no one's being persuaded, all the interests are pretty much set, and realism might be a pretty good assumption. If you're asking a broader, deeper question, like how did we get into this crisis in the first place, then realism might tell you less. But as the bombs are sailing at you, you might not care how we got into this mess. You just want to get out of this mess. In which case, you might adopt a very different kind of theory. It all depends on the question you think you need to answer. Yes, please?
As you said before, the US are trying to share around the world as an image of the state that every time will bring peace around the world. But I would like to share an example. When Obama, during his administration, he decided to retire the soldiers from Iraq. But at the same time, the sales of arms around the world from the US skyrocketed. So, in your opinion, what we should do to have a better understanding of world leaders' policies if their behavior is so conflicting?
Say that last sentence again, please.
No. What we should do to have a better understanding of world leaders' policies if their behavior is so conflicting?
Again, to me, it would depend. I can't answer that in the general. It would be about the specific. I mean, when I talked about Americans going off and making sure that, other people have elections and free press and stuff, I was being sort of abstract. It was a hypothetical, although Americans, Lord knows they do this. They're hypocritical about it, right? They are not. I have a whole line of research on hypocrisy, and I have discovered I have no shortage of material. The number of leaders who say one thing and do the other thing. Oh, this is a very large research domain that could keep you busy for many, many years. I think I might not quite understand your question. I mean, if the leaders are really conflicting, I mean, diplomats actually work in a funny way. I think of diplomacy as being all about social construction, because diplomacy often is about changing the other party's mind about what they want, what a good solution looks like. So in some way, diplomats are champion social constructivists, or they live social construction. They do social construction. That's their job, to do social construction, because they're trying to create an impression of the country and in a good world, that one that will last longer than the leader, or that will sort of offset the conflict among leaders. But in negotiating rooms, like if we're in the crisis, again, they're trying to get the other side to change their mind about what they want and what they'll accept. You can model that as a bargain in a rational choice world, and sometimes that might be what's going on. But we know that historically from evidence that there are lots of situations where over the course of long negotiations, people do start to change their minds about policies. And you get walks in the woods, you get all kinds of things that go on in diplomatic interactions that change people's minds. The reverse could also happen, I suppose. You would make someone mad, and then you would socially construct your way into a conflict that you didn't intend. Is that?
The thing is that, but we can only change our mind after some years after some facts happen.
I don't know. I mean, how fast it has is an empirical. How fast the changing of mind is an empirical question. I mean, I don't think there's a theoretical answer to that. I think it depends on what the case tells you. The evidence tells you about how quickly people change their minds about things. Sometimes it could be quite fast. Sometimes it could be very slow. So, yeah, please.
I had a question about the World Bank. So you said that initially the purpose of the World Bank was to make the individual states or individual countries richer, but then Robert McNamara changed the approach and he wanted to make individual people richer. And my question is, how does the World Bank's approach differ based on if you want to make the states or individual people? How does that approach or the decisions about what loans to give out? And also I was wondering if the World Bank can have an opposite effect. So if it gives out a loan that doesn't use the way it's intended, can that make the people who took out that loan even more impoverished? So does that defeat maybe the purpose?
So those are two very good questions. The answer to the first question about what happens when McNamara comes in, he has to figure out how do we as a World Bank organization actually do policy alleviation, right? What loans do we make? And so there are two things going on here. One of the fights that he had to fight was there was this principled notion, or maybe it's a question, the question his policies posed for the major shareholders of the bank. Most of the voting shares in the bank are held by rich countries. And it's a weighted voting system inside the bank. Those governments have to agree to this change. And the question is, if you're going to lend for poverty alleviation, you now are interfering in the domestic affairs of countries. You are going to be lending for things like small farmer agriculture. This is the Green Revolution in the 1970s, for example, so we're going to make loans to small farmers, give them better fertilizers and seeds and all these things so they can grow more food. In urban areas, we're going to put in place clean water systems and sanitation and sewage in poor slums and poor parts of big cities. And that will make the lives of poor people better. But there's no bankable return on investment on sewage systems, right? The poor people aren't paying for it, they don't have any money. So, the governments might prefer to have that money for themselves, to use however they want, and give to their cronies and their friends. So there was a political fight about this. Would the bank be able to make these kinds of loans? And again, McNamara and there's a whole team of people who come in with this. They're able to persuade rich countries, and they only have to persuade the rich countries because they have they have the voting shares at the bank, that they want to do this thing. The poor country governments who are losing out because they no longer have all the money just have to accept it. The second question you asked about is, what happens when loans are not used well? This actually I took up in another line of research because I thought it was an interesting puzzle in that the bank is continually lending and world poverty keeps not going away. The poor are still here, they're growing in number, it's a problem. So how do we judge that and how should the bank react to that? And the countries just keep getting more and more in debt over time. They're borrowing not just from the bank, they're borrowing from the IMF, they're borrowing from bilateral aid from rich countries. And around the year 2000, there was a big civil society push that said you should just forgive the debts of these most highly indebted countries, the HIPC countries. And it was a civil society pitch, and big chunks of that debt got forgiven. But you're right that there's not a good punishment mechanism for poor countries that implement badly. They don't have any money, right? You could stop lending to them, but then you're punishing the poor, and there's a political price at the bank. They're supposed to be helping the poor. So it's a dilemma for the bank to figure out, how can I help people when the money just seems to disappear when I send it there? And over decades, the bank has struggled with this mightily, and they're still working on this problem. This is a really hard problem, but they keep trying new ideas, and the programs change. You can watch an evolution of the programs over time. As if I try a new idea and it doesn't work, what do? I try yet another new idea, and there's a whole evolution about this, both at the bank and at the UN, when they try to think about how should we deal with global poverty. The sustainable development goals are the current enthusiasm goal. The bank is involved with those, the UN is involved with those, the IMF is involved with those. We'll see. There were Millennium Development Goals that we were going to do a lot of things by 2015. Did we do all those things? No. What did we do? Did we stop? You might think that would be the rational choice explanation, right? You set a big goal, it doesn't work, states should say, forget it, we're done. No more development goals. That's not what they do. They say, let's have more development goals, and we'll make the goals harder to reach. That's what we have now. I find that a fascinating puzzle when I'm writing about this now, because this makes no sense. Anyway, as you can tell, I get enthusiastic about stupidity in the world, which is a lovely thing to study. So. Yes, please.
From your point of view, what are the new ideas that are changing the world?
There are a lot of them. I would say a lot of the most interesting conversations are happening around the environment right now, and that we're in an interesting place now where there are still recalcitrant governments. My own government is right there, not saying there is no climate change. But this is getting to be a very hard position to maintain. Even in the United States, the public opinion polling is overwhelmingly now persuaded by this. But this actually raises some of your colleagues' questions. Even if we believe that this is now the contours of the problem, what do we do? And what might work? And unlike global poverty, where you can keep trying new things because there's always new poor people, there's only one planet. And you don't get so many tries to deal with the environment. So, but the political problem is, how do you connect the good ideas to political leaders who could do something about those ideas? And that's a tricky thing, right? So again, elections are only part of this, and they're a very imperfect mechanism because elections often are problematic, let's just say that. So, but people don't always know what's going to work, and in the environment, often it's not, sometimes it's very clear what would work. You know, how to clean up our dirty river, we sort of know how to do that. How to fix the atmosphere, this is not so obvious how you do that. But if I were, that would be a really interesting research topic to find out how environmental science thinking and business thinking that develops the technology. Yes, exactly. That would be, and the question is, you know, can you expand that? How would you persuade powerful people to do more about that? And where it works, why does it work there and not over here? Can I compare and learn what are the conditions that make these ideas more effective, less effective? That would be useful to know.
Thank you.
Yeah, so. Oh, yes, please.
I would like to know, according to you, how relevant is the role of civil society in global governance institutions as regards basically the changing of ideas and consequently policies?
I think the answer is it depends on the issue area. But when I think historically, big changes in civil society eventually tend to create big changes in policy and social life. So my good friend and colleague Catherine Sickink has been working on the human rights regime, for example, and she would go back 200 years. So it's again, this very long view about how these change. And she would say, again, this is 2 steps forward and 1 step back, right? You make progress, and ooh, then bad governments and world wars come along, but then civil society is persistent and can often do these kinds of things. But civil society can have very diverse effects. So the nationalist movements around the world, that's civil society. Those are citizens expressing their views, and they're not big, happy, global, we're all friends views. They're I like my people views. It's a nationalism. And so it's a very different sense of who we as a country ought to be, to whom do I have responsibilities. If you're a sort of a deep nationalist, you might not care about people in poor countries. I want that money to come home and help the people at home. So your policies would change. You know, whether this will last over time or whether it will, you know, this is a blip and it will go, I don't know. But civil society actors are hugely important. I'm also working on cybersecurity, and civil society has been very articulate. They're concerned about privacy, for example. They're very concerned about that. They're also just concerned about a lot of other technology issues. Artificial intelligence is complicated and could do some extraordinarily powerful things. That biotechnology could do very powerful things. And civil society would like some say about this, but you know, how easy that is to do depends on the situation. But they're persistent, they're always out there. So. Yes, please.
About the structure agency issue. It's quite easy in a democratic society for citizens to shape the structure. What do you think in a totalitarian state? Like, if citizens in a totalitarian state have less voice than democracies, do you think that's still the same interchange between structure and region?
I mean, theoretically, yes. Because in the same way, even in a totalitarian state, even in North Korea, structure is very powerful. It socializes people in these powerful ways. But the question is whether over time they can continue to do this. Over the long haul, those kinds of regimes tend not to last. Where the crack will come is, we would all be rich or happy people if we knew that. I don't know that thing. But one way to think about politics is what kinds of opportunities does the structure give you as civil society actors, for example, and how can you exploit those? So in Sikink's work, for example, on Latin America during the dictatorships, some of those regimes that Pinochet were quite repressive regimes. They were dropping dissidents out of airplanes in the Atlantic Ocean and making them disappear and do that kind of thing. But people found ways to make, inroads in different kinds of ways. But sometimes it can also be technocratic. Sometimes it can be expert knowledge that changes governments in the way they do business, like my economists at the World Bank. I mean, it can be there are a lot of different paths to influence and the movement of ideas. So, but you're right, there are more openings sometimes than in some structures than in other structures.
Time is up.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.